Yeah, so thank you for inviting me along to present some new work with the web seminar. So this is part of a project which I'm calling How to Simplify the Brain. So the idea is to look at neuroscience, both contemporary and historically, as through the lens of methods of abstraction. So interpreting why neuroscientists make the assumptions that they do, sort of build the kinds of models and experiment and use the experimental practices that you see as different ways of dealing with neural complexity. And I'm also in this paper tying it to the philosophy of science debate over perspectivism, also known as perspectival realism, because one thing that I found in my research in philosophy of neuroscience so far is that I think the autonomy of different perspectives, be they mechanistic perspectives, computational one, or dynamical systems one, has been underappreciated. So what I'm attempting to do in this paper is just to show that there are different perspectives on one brain area, just the motor cortex, and discussing the motivations for why there are these different perspectives, why scientists are led to sort of develop these radically different ways of describing the one system, and as I say, fitting that into the philosophy of science debates over perspectival realism. So I'm going to start the talk today by talking more about perspectivism in science. And I guess this is also a plea for philosophers of neuroscience to pay more attention to philosophy of science more generally, because it's a shame that because, well, it's a shame and a good thing that, you know, areas of specialization within philosophy of science have become so distinct now that sometimes things that are going on in general philosophy of science don't have so much impact on niche areas like philosophy of neuroscience. So I'm attempting to bridge that. I should also mention that this chapter is, this paper is a chapter in a book edited by Michaela Massamy and Casey McCoy, which is on perspectivism in science. So this is for a general philosophy of science book. So I hadn't written it with a dedicated philosophy of neuroscience audience in mind. So I'm happy to discuss more of the details of the topics when we get to the discussion. All right, so I will move on. So one way I like to think about perspectival pluralism is as telling us that the picture of the world that we get through science is something like a cubist painting, that the world, the scientific image, if you like, the world as we see it through science is kind of fragmented and distorted, and we're getting at nature through multiple viewpoints, and it's not quite clear how those different viewpoints line up with one another, if they ever do or will line up with one another. And you can contrast this with just straightforward scientific realism, which just kind of takes the scientific image as sort of straightforwardly depicting reality in a without much filtering or distortion, but just sort of, even if not right now, giving you the truth, the one truth of things, ultimately aiming at that. Obviously, these are sort of, there's lots more subtleties and different versions of scientific realism right now, but certainly in the basic idea is that science aims at some kind of unvarnished truth of the world, and so ultimately that will just be one consistent, internally consistent story about how nature is. Another thing about scientific realism is that it kind of presupposes a God's eye view of nature, which is one of the reasons why perspectivists don't like it. I won't go too much into that, but it's kind of a bit tangential to what I'm talking about today. But more relevant is the notion of the relationship between our scientific models and theories and the nature it describes as one of correspondence. So this will be familiar to you from Kaplan and Craver's 3M models to mechanisms mapping criterion, where, and this is a criterion for explanatory success, but the idea is that if the model is explaining the thing it purports to explain, there should be a correspondence relationship between variables in the model and the entities or activities in nature being represented. So a problem for scientific realism is pluralism. So you'll be familiar with the pessimistic meta-induction, which looks at past science and says, well, in the past people described phenomena in so many different ways, and they were also predictively successful. So there was people described combustion in terms of phlogiston, light in terms of the ether. We don't think that's true anymore, so how can you be predictably successful and with a false theory? And this issue about whether the theory is false or not, or whether the terms refer, is not so important to me so much as it shows that there can be sort of radical pluralism, that you can get effective science with radically different ways of describing things. And so the point about perspectival realism is that it picks up on the radical pluralism that is there right now in science if we care to look at it. So Margaret Morrison, who doesn't herself defend perspectivism, she's actually an instrumentalist, but she has this nice example of model pluralism in nuclear physics. So showing how one tiny thing in nature, the atomic nucleus, affords many different ways of modeling it, which are all useful for different purposes and have been predictively successful. So there are classical models, quantum models, kinds of combinations of these. There's a whole menagerie of different models, and they make assumptions that are not consistent with one another. So the reason why this sought to occur is just because nature is very complicated. So this is, if you take one natural system, you can only model or represent some of its properties at once, and so you have to be selective and make assumptions which will leave out the rest of the details. So even one atomic nucleus is complicated enough to afford dozens of different ways of modeling it. And so if a nucleus is complicated, think how much more complicated the brain is. There's causal systems at so many different scales, from molecules up to social levels. So how could we expect just one way of modeling it to be successful independently of other different perspectives? So I'm going to talk now about the specific ways that the brain is complicated, which I call in the paper the Heraclitean brain. And this is a bit pretentious, you might be thinking, but the idea is inspired by John Dupre and Peter Godfrey Smith. So Dupre, in his recent book Processes of Life, has this conjecture that biological organisms fundamentally are processual. So they're the kinds of things that need to keep churning over, need to keep undergoing processes in order to be what they are. So just in a way that something like a hurricane or the eye of the red spot of Jupiter, which has existed for thousands of years, people believe, but in order to be the red spot of Jupiter, it has to keep churning around, it has to keep turning over the material that composes it. And this is just a fact about biological cells. They can't, in order to be things that metabolize, they have to keep reconstituting themselves. And neurons are just one kind of biological cell. Eve Marder's work is very well known in the literature on robustness in neuroscience, and she sort of repeatedly makes the point, as depicted here, that each neuron is constantly rebuilding itself from its constituent proteins using all the molecular and biochemical machinery of the cell. Now, Peter Godfrey Smith says that this fact about metabolism, he's argued that it has important implications for how we think about cognition. As he writes, living systems change their input-output profile as a result of their own activity. The system changes what it does in non-trivial ways, just a result of doing it. Computers, in contrast, are engineered not to change continually in slight ways from their mere operation, except when this changeability is programmed in. Some low-level physical changes will be inevitable, but these are engineered to be as small as possible. Computers are different from living systems in ways that make engineering sense on one side and biological sense on the other. So he argues in this paper that this puts limitations on functional equivalence, and I think that's a really interesting idea, one which I think should be explored further. But where I'm taking it in this paper is to say that the brain, if you could take a God's eye view of it, you'd see that it's always changing what it does. Every experience, everything that happens in day-to-day structure and the physiology of the brain is subtly changing. And this is just a fact about how biology works. But at the same time, this puts there's too much complexity there that could possibly be modeled in any one sort of humanly comprehensible framework. So how do neuroscientists deal with that? And that's going to be, so that's I'm saying is what motivates the two different perspectives that I'm talking about. So I have a little thing from Einstein here. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not too simple. And this simpler. Sorry, my own screen, my own window was cutting over the slide. I misread that. Anyway, this is quoted by two neuroscientists, Gao and Ganguly, when they're talking about this problem of, like, we have huge data sets, we can get loads of data on the complex things that neurons are doing, but how do we actually understand the brain? So I have this framework for thinking about what's going on with the different perspectives that I discuss as analogized to how you would, if you took a river, which is a Heraclitean object, it's always, in some sense, it's always the same river because it's always just this big river there, but on the other hand, it's always churning over its water, and the activity of the water passing through the banks also changes the shape of the bank. So it's just it's a river. It's really, really complicated. How would you model it? There's a physics of fluid dynamics. I'm just giving like a pastiche of ways that you would simplify this kind of Heraclitean flux. So the first thing to do is approximate to stasis. So just cut a cross section through the river, or imagine it's at time t, not extended through time, and then ignore the dynamics and ignore the changes of composition of the river. And so one representation which approximates to stasis is what you see on a map. It's just a river in one snapshot at a time, and it's not giving you all of the details of the river by any means, but it does something. It does convey useful information. Another way is to find simple flow patterns. So if you model the dynamics and change, so you're modeling the dynamics and changes in composition. You're not completely ignoring that, but you're ignoring all of the small currents and eddies that will be there. If you look at the photo of the river, that you can see there's all kinds of stuff turning around, which you can just ignore and sort of try and represent the major flow patterns and seek a compact representation of those. So these, I'm saying, are analogues to the two perspectives I discuss in the paper. So the information processing / intentional perspective does this thing of approximating to stasis by assuming that each neuron has a fixed response property. So each neuron in motor cortex is tuned to represent a specific kind of movement. It's not modeling the dynamics. It's not trying to capture the evolving activity over time. And it has an important assumption that child-to-child variability in the responses is noise. So it's saying that there is underneath each neuron inherently a fixed response property, and then the variation that you see from child to child is just noise. Average that out. The other way to go is to take the dynamical systems perspective and look for those simple flow patterns. So you're modeling the dynamics in a state-based representation, and you perform dimensionality reduction. So instead, this would be the equivalent to finding like the major flow patterns, as opposed to attempting to chart the dynamical evolution of every single neuron, just as you wouldn't try and model the dynamical evolution of every single water molecule in the river. So I'll say more about what dimensionality reduction is shortly. So I'll say now something more about the debates within neuroscience about what the motor cortex is doing. So there is an old-fashioned view which is associated with people like Wilder Penfield, that within the motor cortex there's like a representation of your whole body, and so activity in each tiny portion of the motor cortex represents movements in the corresponding body part. But then there's this question raised, well, is it movements that are represented or muscles represented? And the neurophysiologies couldn't find any conclusive answer on this. There's reasons for saying it's either one of those things. So I have a reference on the slide there to a recent paper which discusses this and more different perspectives on the motor cortex than I can discuss in this paper. What I said about the informational and intentional perspective there was, I was saying before that it was approximating the stasis. Another way of thinking about it is also that it's approximating to a non-living system. So the core of it is this analogy between brain or individual neurons and non-living information processing devices like computers or circuits. And as the Godfrey-Smith thing pointed out, in those non-living systems, they're not changing what they are constantly through their own information processing activity. So that even just by constructing that analogy, you've removed from consideration all kinds of metabolically based stuff going on that would just complicate the picture. So it's a really useful simplifying strategy to employ this brain-computer analogy. So it allows you to say there is one sort of function that a particular neuron performs, and it could be implemented in a brain, it could be implemented in your computer. By taking this functionalist approach, you're giving yourself an excuse to ignore all kinds of biological mechanisms that are there in the brain, which people know are in there, no one would deny that, but are assumed to be irrelevant for information processing. So it's just a handy simplifying strategy. That's what the essence of it. So in particular with motor cortex neurons, one popular model that Andy Schwartz at Pitt is one of the people who's sort of developed and used this model for a long time. It's to say that individual neurons represent movement. So if you take neurophysiology data like this, it shows that the firing rate of the neuron changes smoothly with direction of movement. So you're saying here that it's tuned to particular 0 degrees, it's firing maximally there. And this is known as cosine tuning because you can fit data like this with a cosine curve. When this kind of model is used in brain-machine interfaces where you're attaching electrodes in a computer to the motor cortex in order to drive a robotic limb, then you're assuming that a motor command is the aggregate of single neuron activity, and it's an assumption of the model that the tuning preferences are stable. Sorry. Okay. Oh no, I'm going the wrong way. Should stop doing that. Historically, this was inspired by the fixed filters model of the visual system, that you should be familiar with, the quantitative version of the Hubel and Wiesel type picture of V1, say. And this is just pointing out that the representational model of motor cortex has been used in these practical applications. So a sort of updated version of the Georgopoulos model is sort of in the computer decoding this patient's neural activity. So to go on to the dynamical perspective, so this is sort of a more recent arrival. You might be familiar with it from the work of March Churchland and Krishna Shenoy, just within the last 5-6 years. But they say that this way of thinking about the motor cortex sort of harks back to Thomas Brown, who was an associate of Charles Sherrington, and this idea that the motor cortex isn't fundamentally just representing movements, but it's just generating rhythmical patterns which then just causally drive movements downstream of the motor cortex. So this is one of the figures from the paper by Shenoy et al., who are arguing for this dynamical systems perspective. So they're saying that if you look at the motor cortex as a code, you would say that there's this representational or intentional relationship between the neuron firing and activation in the muscle or a movement. And from their dynamical perspective, they say the motor cortex is this flexible pattern generator. And what it's doing is, like I say, sort of generating oscillations which then cause movements in the body, and different combinations of these different oscillatory patterns are the templates for any kind of movements that the body can perform voluntarily. So I said before I talk about the dimensionality reduction. So this is sort of a key part of the technical machinery behind the dynamical perspective. So it's really come into fruition with the ability now to record from 100 neurons simultaneously, whereas the coding approach was really associated with single neuron neurophysiology, so just recording one neuron at a time over lots of trials and then averaging. So the population model approach sort of generates these huge data sets. So for every trial, you have a raster plot of 100 neurons, and one way of dealing with these large data sets is to go from this 100-dimensional space on that top row and doing something like principal components analysis or factor analysis, which sort of finds the correlation and covariance across the different neurons and then represents the population activity in a ideally low dimensional space. So it's normally about 3 to 10 dimensions. Here it's, well, I say, yeah, normally about 10 dimensions. They've represented it as 3 dimensions here because it's easier to visualize. And this is an image from Mark Churchland's paper, which is a controversial paper. Lots of people said that the interpretation was overreached. But anyway, this is one of the founding arguments for this dynamical perspective. And what it conveys here is this idea at the basis of things that the fundamental movements that a body does in order to stay alive are oscillations. So a leech swimming, a monkey walking, but also think about breathing and digestion. They're just sort of waves of activities in the muscles. And so voluntary movements like a monkey and voluntary sort of one-shot movements like a monkey reaching, they're saying that the same neural machinery that drives repetitive movements is just sort of tweaked so that you get the same sort of neural oscillations in a new kind of combination will give you a one-shot movement. And they claim that if you do a particular kind of dimensionality reduction, then you get what they call J principal components. You'll see these oscillations in their state space, and they say that's the signature of the right kind of oscillations in the neural activity. And this has been disputed by other people, and I'll talk about that later. So the summary so far is that in, so I'm just checking the time. So the summary so far is that you have these 2 different perspectives. One focuses on, one focuses on the activity of a single neuron. The other looks simultaneously at population. So you see already there's a technical component that forms a perspective, like the nature of perspectives in science is sort of related to just what is achievable at any given phase of research in terms of experimental methods. And they each have different kinds of representations that they favor. One is single tuning curves, the other is sort of space trajectories. One presupposes an intentional relationship between the neurons and movement. The other said it's just a causal relationship. The origin of the intentional perspective is ultimately from computer science, whereas the mathematical techniques from the dynamical perspective come from physics. And so you have very different modeling frameworks. One is based in information theory, the other is dynamical systems theory. And they differ in how they simplify the brain. One is via abstraction to a coding scheme, the other is by dimensionality reduction. And you can think of the information theory perspective as inherently atemporal. So it's not as if people are denying that when they use that framework that, you know, coding is dynamic or anything like that, but built into information theory is this a kind of way of thinking about information in which the time course and the over which things happen doesn't matter to information processing. And on the other hand, the dynamical perspective is inherently important. It's all about temporal change. Okay, so in this part of the paper, I'm talking about so how do we think about perspectival truth? So I've presented this case study and argued that the need to simplify a very complicated Heraclitean thing, the brain, sort of drives these different ways of simplifying it. And from these 2 perspectives, you get very different pictures of what the brain is like. One says it's a one says it's a, you get different pictures of what the motor cortex is like. So I should point out that the people that advocate the dynamical systems perspective in the motor cortex aren't the dynamicists or embodied cognition people that you find in philosophy. So they restrict their claims to what the motor cortex is like, but the whole dynamical systems approach does connect it in interesting ways to dynamicism within philosophy of mind. So people like Tony Chameros and Van Gelder, but sort of bracket that. So anyway, what I was saying was that the different ways of simplifying the brain give you different perspectives on what the motor cortex is like. So on the one hand, you say it codes movement. On the other, you say that it's a pattern generator. So can these two perspectives be reconciled? Do we ever get to the truth of the brain, which I depict by like getting to the real bottles and fishes in this cubist painting? The one philosopher that's written about this is Michaela Massimi, so a very nice paper that came out recently in PPR. And she talks about 4 kinds of perspectival truth. So one is a contextualist kind of truth, where she says that, which she calls P3, where knowledge claims in science are perspective dependent in 3, when their truth conditions depend on the scientific perspective in which such claims are made. So you could say M1 neurons code movement parameters is true in the context of the representational theory, and it's false in the dynamical context. So the truth of this claim really depends on which perspective you are embedded in. So the benefits are that it upholds a realist intuition that science gets things partially right due to representational success of modeling practices. So each of these perspectives does have its own empirical successes, and you can say, yeah, and so having context-dependent truth can make sense of that, and it's supposed to be a good thing that it rejects this monistic God's eye view of scientific knowledge in favor of a plurality of perspectives qua families of models. And she says they offer idealized, inaccurate, and yet still true perspectival images of an independent world. But there are reasons to worry about this, and as Massimi writes, perspectival truth evokes the Kantian stereotype of noumenal reality receding beyond the realm of appearances, i.e. water as an object in itself is not amenable to scientific knowledge, or you could say the brain as an object of experience is the subject of different scientific models, none of which can claim to represent the properties of water. She's talking about water here, as they are in themselves. If accuracy is a never achievable goal, all we are left with are idealized perspectival images of a target system. Perhaps we should not ask for more from perspectival truth. So using her example of water, and she's talking about the difference between it's statistical mechanics and hydrodynamics. Using that example of water, she has this notion of perspective dependence in another sense, in a stronger sense, where the two different perspectives are used to cross-validate each other's claims. So if you can recover some of the parameters that are necessary in one perspective by analyzing things from another perspective, then you have a more robust and sort of notion of perspective-dependent truth. So look, it's interesting to think about this in the light of the debates that are happening, still ongoing, about the relationship between the informational and dynamical perspectives on the motor cortex. So, like I said, the Church and et al. 2012 paper was rather controversial because they took these curves in the JPC space to be evidence for their dynamical theory, that there are these important oscillations in the motor cortex. And then the response from people favouring the traditional informational view was to say, oh, even if our picture of the motor cortex is the accurate one, you would still see these oscillations in JPC space. So what this figure is showing is that even on the assumption of cosine tuning, you will still see these curves. But then the point of this paper from Michaels et al. Is to argue that there are still other phenomena that can't be recovered fully from the informational perspective. So they say things are better explained by the dynamical systems approach. So the overall sort of flavour of these debates is somewhat acrimonious, because like one way you might think about perspectival pluralism in science is that everyone could sort of sit around and agree, well, yeah, you need a different model for different tasks, and we can't expect our own approach to be like the one whole truth of matters. But amongst in the field itself, each model is presented as ultimately going to be the best way of explaining motor cortex. Yeah, that said, if you read the Omrani et al. Paper, which talks about some of the other perspectives on motor cortex, there is sort of more attempts there to sort of build bridges across the different views. So it's not, it would be wrong to say it's fully acrimonious, but there isn't right now, between the dynamical and the information processing perspective, like a real attempt at sort of mutually respectful acknowledgement. So how I explain this in the paper is that the reason why people don't just sort of sit down happily and say, yeah, well, they're just different mathematical lenses to view the one system, and that's fine. The reason why they don't do that in this case is that ultimately, if you go beyond the formalism, there are different sort of qualitative implications about what the motor cortex and ultimately what the brain and mind are like, which are not consistent. So I'm saying that there is some degree of P4 style cross-validation at the purely quantitative level. So this thing that Masumi advocates of being able to recover some of your phenomena from either kind of model. And Randy Beard talks about this as well. There's a reference to that in the paper. But if you go beyond just the numbers that, or just the, yeah, like I said, just the formalism that are associated with each perspective, there, and sort of ask, well, what's the picture of the brain of coming out of this? Then you don't get a consistent view. So one response here is just to be an instrumentalist and say, well, what's causing the inconsistency is this interpretation and this like trying to associate the use of a dynamical model with radical embedded and embodied cognition. So if you just drop that big picture thing and just stick to the calculations, then there's no problem. And I'm not unsympathetic to that. So in here I'm saying that someone like, you might be inspired to this instrumentalist view if you read Beer and Williams's paper, because they're saying, here, I'll read it out, as mathematical theories, information theory and dynamical systems theory can be applied to any system that takes the proper form to meet their defining requirements. They intrinsically make no scientific claim as to what's really going on. Instead, they are just viewed as distinct mathematical lenses through which we can examine the operation of the system of interest. Applying the language of information theory or dynamical systems theory to a given cognitive system is never right or wrong. The mathematical languages themselves are merely more or less useful to a given purpose. So I don't think Beer and Williams themselves are necessarily instrumentalists. You could also read the whole paper as them being perspectivists. But at the same time, it gives you an excuse, like, just to not do this thing of interpretation and just let the models do what they do by themselves. But I think it leads to a dilemma for the ambitious kind of perspectival realism that Michaela Massimi is advocating. So this P4, the strong requirement, requires knowledge claims of each perspective to be positively assessed by the other perspectives. And this only occurs if assessment is restricted to quantitative predictions of the model. There's no positive assessment for the interpretations of these models, like the claims about there really is coding or it's really just a pattern generator. Those are really inconsistent with one another. So either the P4 knowledge claims must be restricted to predictions of the mathematical models, and I'm saying this then results, you're sort of deflating everything down to instrumentalism, or if it's not so restricted, then you don't have convergence of knowledge claims across perspectives. One perspective must be the truer one, and you lose pluralism. So what I mean by instrumentalism here, I mean instrumentalism in the old-fashioned anti-realist sense, this sort of view of science where the content of scientific theories is just the empirical predictions. And every time that you sort of talk about unobservables or talk about the world picture associated with a scientific theory, that's going into metaphysics, and that's bad. And I think that's one response that you might have to this this result of pluralism, but it's completely incompatible with the kind of realism that Michaela Massimi is trying to associate with perspectivism. She wants perspectivism to be a kind of scientific realism, a kind of view in which scientific theories tell you about nature and do more than just allow you to make empirical predictions. So I have a conclusion which I'll just sketch, which says that there's a Kantian view, which is the best way to think about perspectival pluralism, and that's neither a standard scientific realism nor an instrumentalism. And to motivate this view, I won't say about that. I'll just go straight to it. So it's quite an easy idea to think about. So one way of thinking about abstraction, which I call Platonic abstraction, is just this idea that the mathematical formula which sort of describes a computation going on in the brain is some kind of abstract object which the brain partakes of. And this is how people like Galileo, Descartes, and I think ontic structural realists today think about the relationship between sort of maths and objects in nature. They think that somehow mathematical structure is an underlying reality, which, so I should rephrase that. I don't think like believing in Platonic objects is sort of a commitment of ontic structural realism so much as like you believe that the underlying reality of nature are these structures which can be described by mathematics. And so what the job of the scientist is to discover those structures. And so when you have a different way of describing nature through mathematics, so a different kind of reality conveyed to you by mathematics, this becomes a puzzling conflict. But what I call Kantian abstraction sort of begins with the brain in itself, which doesn't have any sort of inherently mathematical structure, but when human scientists need to model it and describe it, then they have to, in some sense, project structure onto it. And if you take into account that there's this human dimension in the mathematical structure that is revealed, then it's not surprising that there are multiple ways of doing this, just because, as I said, there are multiple ways of imposing order on a very complex system. And that's the end.